Good day to you. You know, in just about a week or so, we're going to start to see the beginning of leaves pouring out of the trees. And soon, everything that you've been looking at for the last 4 or 5 months is going to fade to the background, because what will be in front of it now will be trees full of leaves. So spaces like this outside are going to look completely different. Meanwhile, many of us are in the house, and in my particular house, a family house, a person who's in his 50s, my regular routine involves reading a newspaper on the counter like this one. And maybe at some point in the day, not all that likely, but at some point in the day I might watch some of the television over here. And certainly what I'm going to be doing for most of the day, not just because that's what I do for a living, but also because it's so much more used now for entertainment and information, is the internet, which is right here on my dining room table. So the question is, when you go through your life, what kind of media content do you come across? Yeah, the media content that you come across on your television, by reading a newspaper, by looking at the internet. You see, content is very much related to accessibility. Our last issue that we discussed, our last chapter, forgot my notes, so I'm going to go grab those. Very much related to accessibility, because the media content that you get to see is in large part determined by what you're exposed to when you go around your daily life and bump into media. And so in this chapter, we take on media content. It's that part of the tree that you see more than any other part most of the year. It's the leaves. And so that's why it's the most important part of the media system, because it's what you see and access and listen to, and in some cases touch the most. What we're going to do in the next 2 classes that involve this particular subject matter is we're going to break down media content, because it is so important, into 2 separate instructional lectures. So you get one this week and you get another one next week. And when we start to define media content, we're talking about something that has been in the past looked at rather confusingly. In the past, when researchers have looked at media content, they've divided it into form and content. Well, how can you divide something into itself? It's been very, very difficult to understand that. So the new definition that I try to come up with to help us understand exactly what it is that content is it's form plus substance. And form is going to be the look and the feel of something, like when you step outside and that breeze comes up and you feel a little chilly air. That's sort of the form of outside. But substance, which is the other side of content, the other part that makes up the definition, has to do with the meaningful data, if you want to think of it that way, that is inside of that form. So it's the written words in a newspaper and what they actually say. It's the TV characters acting out a part. It's the video that you're watching on YouTube. That's the other side of content, is substance. Now we're going to take on 4 countries today. We're going to take on France first. In France, you've got, talking about newspapers, you've got 5 national newspapers, all in different sizes, all in different formats, all with very different content. You've got one that is completely off the wall called Le Canard Enchaîné. My French pronunciation is not that great, but it basically means the duck, the enchanted duck. Canard Enchaîné, and that's a play on that word canard, which also means newspaper. But basically, this particular media form is half cartoons and half newspaper, if you can imagine that. And the cartoons are not funny cartoons, not like Peanuts type cartoons. They're serious cartoons making serious messages, in most cases political statements. Then you also have these other national newspapers, Le Monde, The World, which is a very widely respected and far-reaching international newspaper. You have Le Figaro, which is a really arched-to-the-right conservative newspaper, very much geared towards military or ex-military French people. And then you have a newspaper that you wouldn't find here in the United States called L'Humanité, or The Humanity, and it's a communist newspaper right there in France. And then you have a newspaper called Libération, and that's a newspaper that's about freedom. It's sort of in the middle, but slightly to the left. So with 5 national newspapers, that's a pretty big range, and it's not all that surprising, is it? Because we know about France appreciating cultural diversity and back in regulations, even licensing radio stations only if they're adding to the cultural mix. So these 5 very different newspapers, it's not too figure out why it is like that. Radio-wise, you have a roughly even mix between the public radio stations, which again in France are different because they can both sell advertising and also receive money from the government. That's a unique hybrid, but they are nonetheless public stations that are guaranteed by the government versus private stations. So when you go up through your radio dial, it'll be public station, private station, public station, private station, but also the content is going to be pop, rock, jazz, French culture, symphony, book discussions, scientific discoveries, medical information. It's really intense intellectualism on radio as well as in books. When you talk about TV, you're going to find a lot of the same things hold true for Britain and for Sweden. So let me kind of lump all these three together now. When you talk about TV, you're talking about TV that has a very strong presence of public stations, but also a very strong presence of a lack of advertising, if you can say it that way. You're not just hit over the head constantly with TV in France and TV in France and Sweden and the UK because of that minutage requirement back in regulation, which relates back to the cultural characteristics of these countries not wanting commercialism to creep too much into the delivery of information via mass media. And what it also means on these European countries' television channels is a lot of documentaries, and not documentaries that you might think of as our traditional documentaries, like going into a rainforest and finding a tribe in a rainforest, although you can find those. We're talking about documentaries like following around two people, average everyday citizens who got into a terrible financial situation and lost their house and racked up a whole bunch of credit card debt and could not find jobs. It will do a documentary on following their story. Or you'll see a documentary like I saw in Britain, which was retracing the steps of Alexander the Great, who was one of the greatest military generals in the history of the world, who marched all the way from the top of the Mediterranean all the way across to Africa and conquered the known world. Well, this BBC documentary that I saw actually retraced his steps and had an actor walk this whole journey. It cost an incredible amount of money to produce, I'm quite sure, but they did it really properly because they wanted to do it right and they wanted to have high quality. So that speaks to TV, not just in England, but in France and also in Sweden. And now as I branch out and deviate from my traditional format here, it just makes more sense as I organize this video lecture. Another area of content that you will find that's very similar across all European nations is a lot of nudity. I say a lot, but it just seems that way in relation to what we have in our country, which is virtually none unless you subscribe to a channel or unless you make purchases on your own or unless you use the internet for that. In Sweden, France, and England, though, if you see a drama, for example, on TV where there's a couple who are in love with each other and they end up taking their clothes off and having sexual intercourse, they will show parts of the bodies, including the male genitalia and the buttocks. Now, it's not all that common, but it's very common to see nudity. You can almost count on it coming on TV at some point in the evening because of some show where it's deemed to be integral to the plot. And maybe it's just a movie that's being aired. Also, in contrast to the United States, which I'll be introducing shortly, you find a lot less violent content. You do find violent content, cops and robber shows and mysteries, but where you don't see the content as much as in the fantasy area of content, in movies, in TV shows, you don't see violence, really vivid, blood gushing, people being bruised, people being hurt kinds of violence in the fictitious side of content in Europe. What you are more likely to see when it comes to violent content is violent content in the context of newscasts, where realism justifies showing you what a soldier's dead body looks like, or showing you a civilian who has stepped on a landmine. Those are circumstances that the Europeans, these three countries in general, view as being more appropriate for violent content. So now that I've kind of broken out of the regular structure, let me just finish off both Sweden and also France, the UK, in terms of their newspapers. It's really the part that I haven't hit upon. In Sweden, you have 7 national newspapers, but as we discussed earlier, 4 of them are morning newspapers called the serious